One of the joys of spending an entire year on 3 chapters of the Bible, spending the year in the Sermon on the Mount, is that we get to move slowly, which means we don't rush through some of the hardest parts of it. This morning we get to tackle one of the harder parts in the Sermon on the Mount, which should be fun. And to get started with that fun, raise your hand if you recognize the opening of this book, this opening line of this book. If you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to ask for a glass of milk. Raise your hand if you recognize this opening line of a book. Yes, it is from the children's book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. This book is more than just a cute story, but it is that. It actually shows off the human brain in some fascinating ways. Specifically, it shows off our ability to look ahead and to make predictions about the future, right? Like, we can look at a situation and we are able to anticipate a likely outcome. And then guessing the outcome, we can plan a response to it, right? So if you give a mouse a glass of milk, then what? Well, obviously he's going to ask for a straw. The book shows that we can take this kind of analysis and we can repeat it over and over, extending it out over time. If I do this, then that will happen. For the next minute, I'm going to grossly oversimplify the human brain. By saying that our brains basically fall along a sort of spectrum when it comes to this kind of future planning. From an underdeveloped kid's brain to an overactive adult brain. That's the spectrum we're looking at. Kid brains. Kids don't yet have the ability to look forward, right? They develop it through childhood, but at the beginning, Carson's upset. Carson, don't worry. You have some ability. Like, you knew when you stood up and waved at me that I would address that, right? Yeah. So we gain this over time, but the younger you are, you don't have the ability to look forward, right? Like, as a tiny child, you see candy and you just know that candy tastes good every time you have it. And so you want a piece of candy because candy tastes good. And so you take it and eat it because it tastes good, right? That's the extent of your decision-making process. But tell a child, right? If you have too much candy, you will develop diabetes. And they're going to be like, huh? What? I don't care. Give me candy. Right? Kids' brains, the younger you get, are just peak living in the moment. But as those brains develop, more and more, right, as we grow, as we mature, as we develop the ability to think ahead, to anticipate consequences, our brains don't always stop at just fully mature and able. We sometimes push past the capable of looking at the future, and we get to this extreme end of the spectrum where some adults maybe do nothing but live in the future, sort of always guessing about what the future holds and planning around all of the possibilities. And I'm not sure I would call this, right, like an overdeveloped brain, the way that a kid's brain is underdeveloped, but maybe just an overactive brain, doing too much of what it's supposed to do. Right? This is the brain that can look around at our lives and see a perfect set of circumstances and recognize, man, I have everything I need. Things are okay. But then your brain starts to game out scenarios. I have everything I need, but what if I lose it all? What if I die? What if an earthquake takes us out? What if a plane crashes? Right? We don't just anticipate a likely outcome. our brain starts to anticipate all outcomes and sort of giving special priority to the least likely outcomes, and maybe even special priority to the worst outcomes. So we start to obsessively plan for the worst rather than the most likely. Like I said, this is an oversimplified vision of the brain, but I think it's helpful in this simplification to see these two extremes because Jesus is addressing them both in the Sermon on the Mount. Like we will hear Jesus later in the Sermon on the Mount say, do not be anxious about your life, right? What you eat or what you drink or what you wear, about your body or what you will put on. And then after an extended reflection on anxiety and all of these things, Jesus just summarizes his message this way. He says, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Tomorrow. Like, don't worry about tomorrow, Jesus says. And in this profound way, Jesus is teaching us how to be like children. Later in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is going to say, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is teaching us how this is done. How do we become like children? Kids don't have a fully formed prefrontal cortex. Not yet. Right? And so in some ways, they can't even think about next year or next month or, depending on how young we are, tomorrow in such a way that would let them worry about what's coming tomorrow. I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to do this, but have you ever tried to teach a small child about the future? How do you explain future days to them or weeks? One of my favorite ways to do this is to put the future in terms of sleeps. Maybe you've seen this before, heard this before, maybe you've used it before, but hey, we're going on vacation after 3 sleeps. Why would we say sleeps rather than days? Because days are weird and abstract, but sleeps are concrete. A kid knows, I sleep. And then after that, things happen. And so you're putting it in these really concrete terms, and they can start to count down actual sleeps. And they go, oh, 3 sleeps are gone. Now we get to do a fun thing. In this way, Jesus, his teachings, specifically on prayer, is very childlike. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells us to just tell God that today you need your daily bread. And today, God needs to give it to you. God, I'm hungry. I need to eat today. Give me food. Our translations of this prayer, they sound a little formal, a little fancy, a little gentle. Give us today our daily bread. But it's actually just, in the Greek, it is just this bold demand of a kid who knows that it is her parents' job to feed her when she's hungry. Father, give us, right now, the same bread you give us every day. I need to eat it. That's what this prayer is. Could we live more in the moment than this kind of prayer? And this is what it looks like to trust God as Father, to live as God's children. And so the Sermon on the Mount, it teaches us how to live as though our brains have no ability to look ahead, no ability to anticipate outcomes, no ability to anxiously plan our survival. Become like children, Jesus says. Focus on today. The Sermon on the Mount does say this, does teach this. And then there are passages like this morning's chapter 5, verse 22, Jesus says, "Whoever says fool will be liable to the hell of fire." And I hope you were able this week to spend some time with the Bible Project's playlist that we send out, the playlist for this passage. If you did, then you know that the word hell, the English word hell here, is a weird translation choice for a variety of reasons, but Jesus refers to a specific geographical place, a place called Gehenna. And Gehenna was a valley that was right outside the city of Jerusalem. It's a valley that every single one of his hearers would have seen and traveled through on a trip to Jerusalem. Everyone would have been familiar with this place. And they also would have been familiar with its implications, because it is a valley that had a horrific history. A history that hearers would have known and felt. Gehenna had come to represent the worst evil you could imagine. It was the place where in the past, Israelites had killed their own children, giving them as offerings to God in the name of God. Horrified by this, God promises that it will be in that very same valley where he would judge those who were guilty of these crimes. Such specificity in this place and what it means and represents and makes people feel. For many of us, we hear a word like hell and it's weird and ambiguous in its ideas of torture or judgment. But Jesus was specifically calling on the memory of a place to help his audience feel his message. And so the question for us as we listen then is, what are we supposed to feel? What is Jesus supposed to evoke in us? And at its heart, Jesus wants this crowd to think about the future. He wants them to use their adult brains. He wants them to worry. He wants them to plan. If you give a mouse a cookie, if you call a man a fool, you're going to the fire of Gehenna. Does it land for you? Like, how does it hit you? Does it feel a little dramatic, maybe? Like, can we just step back for a second and go, okay, so the place for child murderers is also the place for name callers? Like, that's extreme? Can we call it that? Like, is Jesus actually saying name calling, right? The thing that we just sort of assume that kids on the playground are going to do all the time is just as bad as sacrificing children on altars of fire. I love that some of you give me such visual demonstrations of what you think and what you're... Jasmine does not think that those are the same. I hope it's not because you're calling people names at school. Jasmine isn't, for sure. Like, we just straight up know these two things are not the same. Right? Like, there's no debate. There's no discussion. These are not equivalent. And so what is Jesus saying? And is he making you a little nervous? Let's just take a minute to look at what Jesus might be doing here. In this passage, he starts with murder. Murder's bad. Most civilizations have agreed to that. And the guilt for it is pretty straightforward. Matthew 5:21, whoever murders will be guilty by the court. And this is like the most basic level of justice that we just know in the world. Every legal system everywhere has something like this. Murder someone and you face justice. We're like, yeah, discipline the murderers. This is good. Nothing controversial. But almost immediately, Jesus presses past our agreement and he starts to get a little weird on us because he then takes anger. A feeling that maybe is familiar to us, that we have in our hearts, an experience that plays itself out in our minds, this emotion that sometimes just comes on us. Like we don't always choose to be angry. Sometimes we're just angry. And Jesus says, verse 22, anyone who is angry with his brother will be guilty by the court. And so what Jesus is doing is he's just describing the exact same consequence for murdering someone as having murderous anger towards someone. And this is another place where we start to wonder, is this fair? Is this just? Do you really get the same consequence for thinking something or feeling something as actually doing something? I mean, in our American legal system, you don't. Should parents start giving timeouts to kids just because they're angry? Or do we reserve the timeouts for when they hit someone or yell? If you don't like this comparison that Jesus makes, hold on. It's going to get fun. Because Jesus then introduces the consequence for insulting someone in a deep and dehumanizing way. And so in verse 22, he says, whoever calls his brother good for nothing will be guilty by the Sanhedrin. I mean, there is a sense, you read this, you're like, well, at least now you've done something. It's not just in your heart or in your mind, but it's like a few words, right? Words don't actually hurt someone. Big deal. But Jesus is ready to move your case from the local court that dealt with murder to the nation's Supreme Court called the Sanhedrin. That feels like a dramatic move. I think about this. Murder is super serious. Everyone agrees and has always agreed. Murder's a big deal. Yet it's always handled by the ordinary local courts around where you might live, right? They find you guilty, they lock you up. It's pretty straightforward. You rarely take murder cases to the Supreme Court to determine whether someone is guilty of murder. That's a local issue. But Jesus has us taking humiliating insults to the nation, up to the Sanhedrin, Israel's Supreme Court. And then he moves beyond the dehumanizing insult to just the smallest of infractions, a name call. In fact, we have to just be honest with the fact that Jesus will later use this actual name and he will call others by it. He'll call the religious leaders fools. There's a whole book in the Bible, the book of Proverbs, that frequently just calls people fools. And Jesus says, call someone a fool, and it's Gehenna for you. So what are we to make of all of this? I want to make one observation, one conclusion, and then try to offer us a practical path forward. Here's the observation. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is clearly using Gehenna as a dramatic extreme designed to make us pause and reflect. I should also say, and actually change our behavior. Let me boldly say what I believe is true. That God is not out searching the world for all of the name callers so that he can gather them all up and throw them into Gehenna. If you've called someone a name before, you can breathe. You aren't supposed to be afraid that the name you called somebody has purchased your ticket to Gehenna. Jesus' extreme, dramatic use of Gehenna, it becomes obvious in the next paragraph when he starts talking about cutting off arms and tearing out eyes so that you don't go into Gehenna, right? There's clearly a hyperbolic language at work here. Jesus is exaggerating in order to move us. This is the observation. But let's get to a conclusion. What does this mean? Jesus may not be serious that name callers are getting sent directly to Gehenna, but he is absolutely serious that name calling is serious business and that it is linked to Gehenna, and we ought to take it seriously. Jesus is using serious imagery to help us grasp the seriousness of the situation. And we need that. How many times have you heard somebody go, what's a little language? What does it matter if I called somebody a name? It's so easy to brush it off, to dismiss it, and Jesus is trying as much as he can to just like shake us awake and say, hold on a second, this is actually so serious. And I may have misled you a bit earlier when I directly compared, if you give a mouse a cookie, he will want a glass of milk, to Jesus saying, if you call a person a fool, you will be guilty of Gehenna's fire. Because the better comparison is actually Jesus' overall argument, right? So what Jesus is saying is, if you call a person a fool, you will likely start to dehumanize them in insulting ways. And if you insult a person in dehumanizing ways, you will likely start to feel justified about your murderous anger toward them. And if you feel justified in your murderous anger towards someone, you will likely try to off them. And if you off someone, you will be guilty by the court. And if you are guilty by the local court, you will be guilty by the nation's highest court. And if you are guilty by the nation's highest court, you will be guilty with God's eternal judgment. There's a path. All right? Here's what Jesus wants us to see. He wants us to see with our brains that can look ahead. Like, we need to look to the future. We can't just dismiss the things that we're doing and saying because they don't seem to have any real effect on anybody right now, but we need to look ahead at the consequences of our relational divisions. Like, we need to use our frontal lobes. They're a gift from God, and they help us look ahead and see how we get there. And so, what does Jesus want us to do? He wants us to see the worst possible future. And we need to assume that it is not only a possible future, but it is a likely future if we stay on the path that we are walking. Right? Like, if we go about our lives name calling, it means that we don't care that much about the people who we name call. That this way of being is a way of living that leads to death. And we need to see that. Because in our conversations with our friends, when we throw around names, when we name call the people that we don't like, we just assume it's just between us. It's actually not that big of a deal. Nobody hears us. They didn't hear it. They don't care. It's not affecting them. But Jesus is saying, no, it is affecting you and the people that you are in conversation with. And there is this deeper human rift that is at work in the world that you are participating in, that you are actually nurturing. It matters. And we could just take a step back and look at history, right? We could look at the inter-Christian wars in Europe from the Middle Ages. We could look at Christians and blood families that fought each other in the Civil War in this country. We could look throughout the world at the various civil wars where actual brothers took up arms and fought and killed each other. We could look at any number of places and times where Christians, followers of Jesus, people who share the same Lord and Savior and Spirit and baptism, took up weapons and they fought each other. And if we look at any of these historical moments and examples, we will see the same pattern. You got to go far back, but you will see at some point there was something so small. It was some name calling. But eventually it grew into dehumanizing insults. And those insults, that sense that they are not as worthy or as human or as loved as we are, has this way of stirring a deep anger, a desire for those people to be gone. And it doesn't take long for that anger to become physical violence. Jesus wants us to see this pattern, to look ahead and see where our name calling will lead. And he wants us to cut it off at the source. Jesus is so fascinating. Because when it comes to our future, Jesus sometimes just let it go. Stop worrying about it. Forget it exists. Just live with God today. Let God be enough for you today. Let God be your source today. And then sometimes Jesus is I want you to obsess over the future. I want you to see the worst possible outcome. And I want you to do your best right now to not go there, but to go here. And it's so interesting. Why here and why not here? Right? Because when it comes to provision and protection, God just says to us again and again, I've got you. Don't worry. And as I reflect on it, I actually think there's a bigger reason. What's the worst thing that could happen to you if you don't eat, or you don't drink, or you don't have the basic provision or protection you need? Well, you die. And that sounds pretty terrible. I don't love death. However, at the very heart of our faith confession is that we follow a God who raises the dead. We worship a God who's not limited by death. And so, when God says, I've got you, he actually means he has us even unto death. That if our path and when our path walks through the valley of the shadow of death, we don't have to fear evil because he is with us. And so we can actually trust the God who raises the dead even to our death. But then notice, when it comes to relationships, there is an end that is worse than death. That if we refuse to be the kind of people who build each other up, if we refuse to be the kind of people who are a blessing to one another, if we insist on looking at other human beings made in the image of God and calling them names, setting them out as our enemies, as them, if we insist on that, what God makes clear is that there actually is no place for us in his future world. Because his future world is a place where human beings live in dynamic and loving relationship with each other and with him forever. Right? So if we insist on calling each other names, God is trying to help us hear that is the very kind of destructive work that tears apart the good world that he is making. He's making a beautiful and good world, and he wants us to be part of it. But our words, our insults, our rejection of each other, our anger toward each other, they simply cannot exist in God's future world. And so there is this question that exists. Do we want the fullness of God's blessing? Do we want to become who God made us to be? Do we want to be image bearers of God whose words encourage and build up and give life and unite and are a part of how God restores and blesses it all? Do we want that? Or would we rather have the alternative? Gehenna. And as Jesus sets it in front of us, you can hear him say, look to the future and get vigilant right now. Right? Like, hey, if there's something wrong with you and another person, drop your offering right now. Get out of here. What are you doing? And worshiping in the temple, just go and make things right. Literally, right now, there's nothing more important than just making things right with other human beings. Like, that is the core work of our lives, is that we would be right with all of God's children. There's a sense that if we don't handle relationships immediately, they will decay, they will fall apart, they will die, they will rot, they will result in death. And if we look to the future, we can see it. And Jesus calls it Gehenna. And so, do something. Be vigilant. Care about the relationships we were made for. This is the work that God has given us. As you think about your life, right now, as you think about your priorities this week, do you think, first and foremost, that the core task that God has given you is to be at work making relationships right around you? How much time do we even have for relationships? There's this weird irony, tension, that we spend most of our lives, most of our days, planning the futures that God tells us not to worry about. That most of our time and our energy is devoted there. And he's like, no, you don't have to worry about that stuff. I got you. But then take your relationships and use our frontal lobe that God has given us to see where our relationships lead. And we ask the question, are our relationships leading to life and blessing and love and abundance, or pain and division and suffering and hatred? God has given us the ability to see the future and to reverse engineer what we ought to do right now for our relationships. And it's not something that we do on our own. It's something we do empowered by God's Holy Spirit that unites us. But it's also something we do in imitation of Jesus, who saw his end. He took on flesh, knowing that his very own people would kill him. But he did it in order to tear down the dividing wall of hostility and to draw all people to himself. And so, do we hunger and thirst for right relationships, or are our lives caught up in other interests and priorities?